In a sweltering covered wagon, King Darius the Third lay bound, not by iron but by chains of pure gold. His own generals had locked them on his wrists. This betrayal wasn't an act of vengeance. It was a business transaction. His captors planned to trade their king for their own survival, but they made one fatal miscalculation about the man they tried to impress. So what happens when the ultimate act of treason is rejected? And what does that say about the true nature of loyalty in your own life? To understand the weight of those golden chains, you first need to understand the world they once symbolized. The Achaemenid Persian Empire in 334 BCE was not just a nation, it was the known world. It stretched from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, encompassing over 40% of the global population. For 2 centuries, its rulers had been the arbiters of civilization, their power absolute, their wealth legendary. But a fatal weakness had been growing at its core for decades, and only one person knew how to exploit it. When Darius the Third ascended to the throne, he inherited this sprawling, ancient machine of power. He was the guardian of a legacy that seemed eternal, a system that had weathered countless rebellions and challengers. But across the sea, in the small, fractious kingdom of Macedonia, a new kind of storm was gathering. A 20-year-old king named Alexander had just inherited his father's army and an ambition that bordered on divine madness. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia with a force that was, by Persian standards, laughably small. No one in the Grand Persian court believed this was an existential threat. It was a provincial nuisance to be swatted away. What they failed to comprehend, what Darius himself could not see until it was far too late, was that Alexander was not fighting for territory. He was fighting to end their world entirely. The first major collision came at the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE. Darius commanded a massive army, confident in his numerical superiority. But Alexander's tactical genius shattered the Persian lines, and in a moment that would define his reign, Darius panicked. He fled the battlefield, abandoning his army, his camp, and even his own family to be captured by the Macedonians. The psychological blow was immense. A king who runs is no longer a king. He is a liability. 2 years later at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, history repeated itself, but on a far grander scale. Darius assembled an even larger force, yet the result was the same catastrophic defeat and the same royal flight. After Gaugamela, the empire began to bleed out. The great cities of Babylon and Susa, ancient centers of power and wealth, opened their gates to Alexander without a fight. Darius became a fugitive in his own kingdom, fleeing eastward into the remote provinces of Bactria and Sogdiana, desperately trying to raise a new army from the ashes of his authority. It was here, in the harsh, unforgiving landscapes of Central Asia, that the final act of his tragedy would unfold. The man hunting him was an unstoppable force of nature, but the men who would destroy him were the ones sleeping in the tents beside his own. You must picture this. A king who has lost everything but his title, surrounded by men who have everything to lose by remaining loyal to him. The stage for betrayal was set, and what happened next reveals a chilling truth about power. And this is where the story stops making sense. The dread did not arrive all at once. It seeped into the camp like a slow poison, carried on whispers and sideways glances. After Gaugamela, you could have felt it in the way the soldiers looked at their king. They had seen his royal chariot turn, had seen him flee the field while they were still fighting and dying for him. A soldier will forgive a general a tactical mistake, but he will never forgive an act of cowardice. The news that followed was a series of relentless hammer blows to his authority. First, Babylon surrendered. The governor, Mazaeus, who had fought for Darius at Gaugamela, simply handed the keys of the world's greatest city to Alexander. He was rewarded for his pragmatism, not punished. Then Susa fell, its vast treasury, enough to fund an army for a decade, given away without a single arrow being fired. Each report that reached Darius's retreating column was another nail in the coffin of loyalty. His governors were choosing survival over allegiance. But this wasn't just panicked fear. It was a cold, logical calculation that was about to be put into motion. To understand the shift, you must put yourself in the mind of a Persian satrap, a regional governor like Bessus. For months you have received letters from Darius, written on papyrus that smells of desperation, urging you to raise new levies, to send gold, to hold the line. At the same time, you receive missives from Alexander's camp. These are different. They do not plead. They offer a simple binary choice: resistance and annihilation, or submission and a place in the new order. Alexander was not just conquering cities, he was conquering futures. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria and a kinsman of Darius, began to hold meetings after the sun had set. The flickering firelight in his tent would have illuminated the tense faces of other nobles: Nabarzanes, commander of the royal cavalry; Barsaentes, satrap of a neighboring province. Their conversations were not the heated tirades of mutineers. They were the cold, rational calculations of men managing a hostile takeover. Every sentence would have been a specific, damning piece of evidence. Darius had fled at Issus, leaving his mother and wife to Alexander's mercy. He had fled again at Gaugamela. He had failed to hold Babylon. He had failed to hold Susa. The empire was a corpse, and they were merely the pallbearers. But here's what nobody realized yet. Not even the people involved. Bessus would have argued that their loyalty was no longer to a man, but to an idea of order. And the only man capable of imposing order now was the Macedonian. The plan they began to formulate was not born of hatred for Darius. It was born of a terrifying respect for Alexander. They observed his methods. They saw that he often treated surrendered Persian nobles with honor, integrating them into his own administration. He was building a new system, and there were positions available for those who proved their utility. Their loyalty was no longer a principle. It was a commodity to be traded for their own survival. If you had been a guard outside that tent, you would have heard the low murmur of their voices. But the true signal of treason would have been the silence that followed. It was the silence of consensus. The decision had been made, and the reason nobody stopped it is stranger than anything that came before. Day by day, the conspiracy solidified. Men who once bowed to Darius now took their orders from Bessus in secret. The king's every move was monitored, his escape routes quietly cut off. He was already a prisoner long before they laid a hand on him. He was trapped in a web of whispers, the last man in the empire to know he had been deposed. And the worst part, the part that reveals the true depth of the rot, hadn't even happened yet. But there's a detail buried in the record that nobody flagged at the time. The moment came not with the clash of swords, but with the quiet parting of a tent flap. It was July of 330 BCE. Darius was in his royal pavilion, perhaps dictating another feudal letter, when Bessus and Nabarzanes entered. They were not alone. They were flanked by soldiers whose loyalty they had already purchased. There was no shouting, no struggle. There was only the dawning, horrific understanding on the king's face. This was not a simple assassination attempt, which in some ways would have been a more honorable end. This was a public and deliberate humiliation. Think about the person you trust most in the world, the one whose loyalty you believe is absolute. Now imagine them standing before you, their face a mask of cold resolve, telling you that your life as you know it is over. Bessus, his own relative, gave the order. The soldiers moved forward, not with weapons drawn, but with a set of chains. As they seized the king, the final calculated insult was revealed. The chains were gold, the very metal that had adorned his throne room, that had paid his armies, that symbolized the immense power of his dynasty, was now used to bind him like a common slave. But the chains weren't just an insult. They were a business proposal. The cold, heavy weight of the gold on his skin must have felt like a physical manifestation of his failure. It was a piece of theater, designed to communicate one brutal message. His sovereignty was now a trinket, an object to be possessed and disposed of. They stripped him of his royal insignia, tore the purple robes from his body, and forced him into a common covered wagon, hidden from the sight of the few soldiers who might still be loyal to him. He was no longer Darius the Great. He was cargo, and what they did next was even more shocking. Here's where it gets worse. And here is the part that should make you deeply uncomfortable, because this wasn't an act of chaotic passion. This was a meticulously coordinated business decision. The golden chains were not merely an instrument of cruelty, they were a strategic asset. The entire conspiracy was an elaborate job application. Bessus and his collaborators had a clear, cold-blooded plan. They would deliver the captured Darius to Alexander as a gift. They believed this ultimate act of submission would be their ticket to power in the new empire. The golden chains were the wrapping paper on that gift, a trophy for the new conqueror, proof that they had not just defeated the old king but had utterly mastered and commodified him. This was not a betrayal in the heat of the moment. It was a calculated move in a political game where their king had become the ultimate bargaining chip. They were selling the throne to the man who had destroyed it, and they were offering the king himself as proof of purchase. Every step was planned. They altered the army's line of march to move towards Alexander's known position. They sent scouts ahead, not to watch for the enemy, but to make contact with him, to arrange the terms of the handover. The entire operation was a terrifying display of organized treason. They had turned the last remnant of the Persian royal army into a delivery service for their own captive monarch. And here's what should feel terrifyingly familiar to you. The men who did this weren't monsters foaming at the mouth. They were pragmatists. They were ambitious executives in a collapsing corporation, liquidating the final asset, the CEO himself, to ensure they had a place on the new board of directors. But their perfect, cynical plan had one fatal flaw. They had misjudged the one man they were trying to impress. They had no idea what Alexander would do when he finally found their prize, and the truth of Alexander's reaction will surprise you. Alexander's reaction was not joy, but rage, because what Alexander wanted was not a king in chains delivered by traitors. He understood something Bessus did not: legitimacy. To the world, Alexander was still a foreign usurper. He needed to defeat Darius in a final decisive battle or accept his formal surrender. Capturing him this way, through the machinations of his own treacherous underlings, was a hollow victory. It denied Alexander the climactic moment he needed to truly become the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne. When Alexander heard that Darius had been taken prisoner, he did not rejoice. He became enraged. He saw it not as a gift, but as an act of regicide in motion, an offense against the very concept of kingship. And so, the hunt began. Alexander took his elite cavalry and rode relentlessly, covering vast distances with punishing speed. He was not riding to save Darius. He was riding to claim him. For Bessus and the conspirators, this was a catastrophic miscalculation. The man they were trying to impress was now hunting them like animals. The closer Alexander's forces got, the more their prize became a liability. The wagon carrying Darius, once their key to a new future, was now slowing them down, a dead weight dragging them towards their own execution. Panic began to unravel their careful plan. They were caught in a trap of their own making. If they were captured with Darius alive, Alexander might choose to free the Persian king, restoring him as a puppet ruler and executing them as an object lesson in loyalty. Their asset had become a death sentence. The final decision was made in a frantic, terrified council on the road. It was no longer about politics or strategy. It was about escape. They had to get rid of the evidence. Two of the conspirators, Satibarzanes and Barsaentes, rode up to the covered wagon. They threw open the canvas flap. Inside, Darius, bound in his golden chains, likely knew what was coming. There was no final speech, no plea for mercy recorded in the histories. There were only the javelins. They stabbed him repeatedly, not a clean kill, but a frantic, brutal act of panicked disposal. They wounded the mules pulling the wagon and rode off, abandoning their king to bleed to death alone in the dust. But the reason they chose javelins, not a clean sword stroke, reveals everything about their state of mind. What you now understand, and what most people never will, is that Darius was killed for the same reason he was captured, as a move in a game he was no longer playing. His death was not the tragic end of a war. It was a panicked administrative decision. This is the systemic truth of every collapsing power structure. The principles of loyalty and honor are the first casualties, replaced by the brutal, unsentimental calculus of personal survival. It is a pattern that did not die with the Persian Empire. You see it in the fall of governments, in corporate takeovers, in the quiet purges that happen in every corner of our world. The system itself demands this kind of betrayal. So now we can answer the questions that have been sitting with you since the beginning. Why the golden chains? Why the elaborate theatrical cruelty of his own men? The answer you've been waiting for is this. The cruelty was the entire point. The chains were a performance. They were a message sent from one group of ambitious men to a new master. They were meant to communicate in the most visceral way possible that the old order was not just defeated, but utterly broken, domesticated, and ready to be handed over. Bessus and his men weren't just killing a king. They were auditioning for jobs in the new world by presenting the ultimate symbol of their defection. They believed this grand gesture of treachery would be seen as a grand gesture of fealty to the new power. And the murder that followed? It was simply the panicked inversion of that same logic. When they realized their application had been rejected, that their gift was seen as an abomination by its intended recipient, they had to destroy it. Darius was stabbed not because he was hated, but because he had become inconvenient. He was a piece of evidence that implicated them in a crime their new potential boss would not forgive. He died because his value on the political marketplace had suddenly dropped to zero, and in the calculus of power, anything with a value of zero is disposable. The golden chains and the bloody javelins came from the exact same place. A desperate, terrified need to be on the winning side. When a Macedonian soldier finally found the abandoned wagon, the dust was still settling. Inside, he saw the body of the King of Kings, lying in a pool of his own blood, the glittering golden chains discarded beside him. He was still breathing just barely, and is said to have asked for water before he died. His last words a message of thanks to Alexander for the kind treatment of his family. But the real tragedy isn't what happened in that wagon. It's how that exact same betrayal happens right now. You see this pattern today. It is not confined to ancient history. It lives in every office, in every political party, in every institution where power is in flux. When the structure begins to fail, watch the people standing closest to the throne. The most dangerous people are never the declared enemies on the battlefield. They are the ones who stand behind the leader, smiling and applauding, all while calculating the exact moment it becomes more profitable to sell the throne than to defend it. The next time you place your absolute trust in a colleague, a leader, or a friend, remember the golden chains. Remember that loyalty is often just a calculation of risk. And when the numbers change, so does the allegiance. The story of what Alexander did to Bessus is a lesson in vengeance. If you want to see how a conqueror punishes a traitor, subscribe, because that chapter is written in blood.